If your lunch ever came in a metal box with a thermos, you're about to feel very seen. These forgotten lunchbox staples once ruled cafeterias and job sites alike, and if you remember them, well, sorry, but you might just be old. Spam and pineapple sandwiches capture a uniquely American taste for sweet and savory combinations that soared in popularity during World War II. Introduced to the American military in 1937, Spam became a staple in many households. The recipe for Spam and pineapple sandwiches represents the culinary influence of Hawaii on the mainland, which intensified after Hawaii became a state in 1959. The sandwich features crispy slices of fried Spam paired with sweet, slightly charred pineapple rings, nestled between slices of toasted bread. This blend of salty meat with the caramelized sweetness of pineapple provides a delightful contrast in flavors. Optionally dressed with mayonnaise or a slice of cheese, these sandwiches reflect a significant Hawaiian influence on mainland American cuisine, particularly during the 1950s when Hawaiian culture gained widespread appeal. The result is a dish that marries diverse culinary traditions in a uniquely satisfying way. Chicken a la king and puff pastry was another little nugget of French culture and cuisine that served us pretty well. So the idea here this time was to stuff creamy chicken and mushrooms into one single pastry, and there would be lots of these individual pastries, each stuffed to the brim. By now, we're talking about somewhere along the 70s. America's always been a big fan of cream. There's really no denying that, but I would say that we've warmed up to mushrooms a lot more than we used to. I don't think they were not popular, but they weren't exactly a standout ingredient that would be making anyone's top 10 or top 5 either. Americans were changing their palates regarding mushrooms thanks to two things, though. One, they had built up a fondness for it thanks to how many Americans, especially ones living on the edges of urban hubs, relied on foraging wild mushrooms. Two, things like cream soups, such as cream of mushroom soups, were already making the pairing of cream and mushrooms popular. This take on puff pastry wasn't exactly a long shot, since the stage was pretty much mostly set. However, I think most people have opted for things like sandwiches and ordering takeout at lunch now, or just getting a coffee. Work culture's really changed, and having a full-fledged meal during your 15-minute break isn't the most appealing option to a lot of people nowadays. Turkey and cranberry sandwiches are a bit of a hit or miss depending on the kind of stuff you prefer. But throughout Thanksgiving, you'd basically see people bringing nothing else but this. Why? Well, I know that you all know cranberries and cranberry jams, sauces, and desserts get really popular around Thanksgiving, but have you ever wondered why? Spoiler alert, it's not just tradition. See, across the Appalachians to California, throughout Wisconsin and Northern America, cranberries have been one of the few things that were always indigenous to our country. That's why we abuse them to the moon and back, you know? Then you throw in canned cranberries and convenience stores popping up in every neighborhood, and well, you start to see how people end up with so many leftovers. Turkey and cranberry sandwiches would be made so often to dispose of leftover cranberries that it wouldn't be uncommon to see pretty much everyone at work pulling up with one of these, though that did mean they got old really fast. Probably why nobody brings them anymore, to be honest. So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Jane Ziegelman, authors of A Square Meal, are certainly no fans. So am I. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. Think of a crispy and tender potato cake that has the perfect crunch to it too, and you have yourself a potato flauty. Potatoes were an ingredient that the horrendous war had not taken away from people, along with other basic necessities like wheat. So dishes involving potatoes saw a huge increase in popularity, and some rather forgotten ones like potato flauties got a whole new chance at life. Originally, it is popularly believed that canal workers came up with this oldie but goldie dish when they would cook grated potatoes over fires until they were golden brown. Whether they did invent the dish or not, it definitely was a comfort food for masses everywhere, and we can easily see why too. Considered classic 40s junk food, we would love to try a good authentic potato flauty today. It was supposed to be this British savory pastry that was probably the only dish best served cold after revenge, but I think it fell short on a lot of fronts. First, let's start with what constitutes a cold pork pie. This frigidly cold piece of British culture comes fully equipped with American favorites like lard, chopped or ground pork, nutmeg, mace, and lots of other stuffings. Plus, you know how people start experimenting with food and adding their own twists and turns wherever they can, no matter what. Who really sticks to tradition when you have like 5 different kinds of cheese to try? Anyway, while all of that sounds pretty good, fun, and a perfect environment for some serious brainstorming with what you can do with a pork pie, it was the savory jelly and cold aspect of it that kind of didn't stick too well. After the baking, you were supposed to pour a savory jelly made out of pork stock into the pie through a pretty tiny hole in the crust. Once the jelly would set and cool, it would enrich the flavor of the pie even more and help to preserve the meat as well. Pork pies were, for this reason, always served cold. However, America is a place that's really used to having their pork pies hot, and as you can probably tell, that's why you don't see bakeries, homes, or offices having cold pork pie days anymore. If we take a small intermission from the dessert side of things and step on over to some hearty, comforting, and homely soups, we'll find a golden recipe lost among the cookbooks of the 20th century that don't get to see the light of day anymore. Pea and ham soup got its name because of how affordable it was. This is probably the cheapest thing on the list to make. Actually, it literally costs just a few cents. All you needed was ham and peas. You'd simmer them in the crock pot with diced ham and some vegetables like potatoes and celery, then slow cook it until the soup got thickened. You'd get this incredibly creamy, lovely soup that was just perfect for winter nights or after a long, exhausting weekend. Maybe you want to ease up on your stomach and eat something healthy for a change, but you still want some familiar flavors to keep you company. A soup like this would be right up your alley. It costs nothing, feels better than most things, and you can make it any time. You could probably even take a nap and wake up to the scent of the soup slowly cooking, becoming the final product. Also, the key to a good sandwich was in its simple ingredients, and Graham knew it better than anyone. That's why she whipped up the classic chicken salad sandwich anytime we craved some comfort food. Chicken salad has been a beloved dish in American homes since the mid-1800s. Grandma decided to make it into a hearty sandwich to make snack time better. Grandma's version of the chicken salad sandwich often included unique ingredients passed down through generations. Depending on where your grandma hails from, her chicken salad sandwich recipe might have a regional flair. In the South, you might find it spiced with a bit of mustard or pickle juice, while in New England, cranberries might be tossed in for a touch of tartness. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches were a really straightforward dish. There wasn't a lot going on here, and it was really just a 3-ingredient dish. Finally, we're going to back sandwiches we can actually recognize and digest. Who has their stuff cold? Not me. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches luckily aren't exactly things you serve cold either. This is a dish best served piping hot. See, liverwurst in itself is just a sausage that's been made with liver and some other parts of meat. Then you take in some raw onions and sauté them, serve them between slices of toasted bread with cheese, and there you go. Liverwurst is something we got from European and German communities, And it was really popular in areas like Detroit and Pennsylvania, where there were strong populations of European communities. Liverwurst was typically always blended with warm spices like allspice and nutmeg too, so you could either make it into this flavorful pâté or slice it and layer it with other kinds of things as well as cheese, of course. It's something that just faded out of relevance, though. It wasn't bad or impractical, but I guess it was a little too simple. Home. Perhaps it's time to give the good old goose a chance to shine again. Sheep's head stew. Now, this is where things get a bit adventurous. This dish, once a staple in many cultures, involves cooking the entire head of a sheep, including the brain, eyes, and tongue. Yes, including. This one is a Scottish delicacy, also known as powsowdy, and was whipped up in Edinburgh, Scotland. Don't confuse it with the other powsowdy, which is a term for milk and meal boiled together. Dried peas and barley are other common ingredients used in this meaty dish. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. At bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. As far as work lunches go, I can't lie. I think you can do better than cold potato and sausage salad. It's not really the worst thing to get in the world, but it's not something I want for my dear viewers. Just picture it yourself. You're at work, there's already an unnecessary scheduled HR meeting, someone's missing their shift, and your boss wants you to cover, and on top of all that, you open up your lunch only to find a perfectly below room temperature salad of, let's see, potatoes and sausages. I wouldn't blame you if you just skipped that entirely, went downstairs and got yourself a granola bar. Really. At least that fuels you, Seriously though, this dish was trying to be really healthy, but one of the biggest things about following a healthy diet is how sustainable it is. Unfortunately for everyone, flavor is a big part of that, because it's the same with your work, You like what you do. You feel like you don't work a day in your life. You eat what you like. You don't feel like you're dieting either. Left but the basics, survival meals had to be simple. Grits and water was about as bare bones as it got. No butter, no milk, just ground corn simmered in water until it thickened into something edible. Grits had long been a staple in the South, where corn was abundant and cheap. Normally, they were cooked with milk or broth for flavor, but when times were hard, even those additions were a luxury. Water had to do. A pinch of salt, if available, might cut the blandness. Some families thinned them out to make the pot last longer, while others let them cook down into a thicker porridge for a more filling meal. There was ingenuity behind this dish. Grits were not only affordable, but they expanded when cooked, making a little go a long way. Leftovers weren't wasted either. Cooled and hardened grits could be sliced and fried the next day, turning yesterday's meal into something with a bit of crunch. For many, grits and water was a meal born out of necessity, but it carried meaning beyond hunger. It was a reminder of resilience, of stretching every ingredient, of doing what had to be done. Polenta's pretty much always been considered gruel food. It's made from boiled cornmeal, and is something even Italian immigrants and Italian Americans consider to be a low-status dish. It was a recipe that was born out of necessity, but recently, lots of high-end restaurants and chefs have embraced it and appreciated it for how creamy it is and the versatility of the overall recipe. In the 1900s, most people were moving away from polenta because they were just more fond of bread and pasta. They were considered simpler, cleaner, and just overall more nice. Lots of Italians also shared the opinion, so there was really no one in polenta's corner. Until the middle of the 1900s. Sometimes you pull yourself out of your own rut, and that's what polenta did. The middle of the 20th century was a time marked by a lot of things, one of them being tourism, and one of the top countries for it was Italy. So many Italicans were visiting, and polenta, capitalizing on that via lots of high-end chefs reinventing it, serving it with things eel truffle oil and seafood, became a bit of a regional specialty. Bologna and cheese stackers were pretty much the ideal American breakfast, something that carried the spirit of our nation as well as all the flavors we've grown to love. Sliced bologna would be layered with cheese from the finest wheels in all of the United States of America. It would be packed in wax paper too, which was a funny little trick, but I'll explain why it was so popular. See, the thing about wax paper is that it traps moisture and flavor in, and that means your stackers stay perfectly fine just the way they were after you first made them. Bologna was always something we've had a deep appreciation for, and this stacker variant just proved that no matter how much the landscape of American cuisine changes, some habits die hard, and some just don't die at all. Not only was it just a good thing to eat before or after work, it was the perfect lunch to carry in a box with you. Plus, by the end of the 20th century, most offices had microwaves too, and you could always just find slices of bologna for cheap at most convenience stores. It was this kind of low-effort, easy-to-source and assemble style of cooking that would overtake America soon enough, and I think that's a part of why a lot of us prefer a latte instead of a sandwich now, ironically enough. Back in the day, when you were out of just about everything except sugar, flour, and fruit, a vinegar cobbler was your only option. No surprise that it was also known as one of the famous desperation pies. Desperation pies are pies in American cuisine made using staple ingredients like butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and any other ingredients that cooks had on hand to complement them or substitute for ingredients that were out of season or too expensive. These pies were more common before refrigeration and canned pie fillings, and during times of hardship like the Great Depression and rationing of World War II. When fresh fruits were hard to come by, people turned to vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruits like apples and lemons. This cobbler used a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices to create a filling that, when baked, tasted surprisingly similar to a fruit cobbler. Instead of chunks of fresh apples, those on a budget would use apple cider vinegar to fake the acidic taste. The crust was made from basic pantry staples like flour, sugar, and butter or lard. The dish reportedly tasted like a custard made from salt and vinegar chips, a rare dessert that leaves the roof of your mouth tingling. Who says you need apples to make an apple pie? Not the Depression era, folks, that's for sure. This mock apple pie was a genius hack that used Ritz crackers as the crust and a sweet, sticky filling made from sugar, cinnamon, and water. It was a budget-friendly dessert that satisfied the sweet tooth without the need for expensive or hard-to-find ingredients. Plus, it was a great way to use up those stale crackers lurking in the back of your pantry. The Ritz mock apple pie became a Depression-era favorite, despite the fact that it was a pastry imposter. How did it work? The aromatic mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, lemon juice, and crackers combined to convince the taster's senses that the pie actually tasted of apples. Mock apple pie actually dates to the mid-1800s. During the wintertime, when apples were scarce and dried apple stores were used up, inventive home cooks would instead use soda crackers or stale bread. The more modern Ritz cracker version came about in the 1930s. Lettuce cups and shrimp salads were pretty funny. I mean, not exactly funny, but interesting. The assembly was something you would need skill for, though, which isn't at all similar to things like peanut butter and bacon sandwiches or corned beef and cabbage wraps. Leaves had to be carefully plucked from the head of the lettuce, and these would end up forming the shape of the cups. You would then spoon the cups with fillings, which were typically things like spices, vegetables, and stir-fried ground meat, but this instance of the dish has shrimp salad instead. Why was something like this popular? Well, besides a lot of influence from Asian culture, such as Thai and Chinese wraps, they were just easy. I mean, sure, you had to get used to making a lettuce cup, but that wasn't really the hardest thing to do. What was absolutely outstanding about these was the presentation. The sheer visual appeal that this dish had wasn't something you could ever compete with, honestly. I mean, a flowery-looking cup made out of lettuce leaves? That's artistic. Plus, the vibrant and colorful fillings inside would just make it pop off even more. As far as food goes, this one was definitely a slay. Once you did get one made, then you would simply have to prepare it by heating it up. They weren't really as good for lunch at work as they were for finger foods and a pretty-looking side or appetizer at a party, though. Around the later half of the 20th century, there was this big public paranoia that had spread concerning health and the after effects of the way Americans had been eating. Thanks to all that rage, we got dishes like vegetable aspic cups. See, lots of Americans were coming home to an angry mom, a worried wife, or a dad who just kept saying he wouldn't pay for the doctor's fees when your eating habits would eventually circle back around to bite you. It kind of did set fear into people's hearts, especially since the arguments were so convincing. Who could deny that they were eating Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's like addicts back then, or even now? That's why there was this newfound room for fusion food or experimental recipes like vegetable aspic cups. Before, you could tell somebody about vegetables that were set in these tomato-flavored gelatins, and they'd just laugh at you. A chilled salad on top of that? But thanks to how easy convenience food culture had made things, with how you could just buy gelatin and frozen veggies whenever you needed, this was actually a really solid and healthy work lunch option. Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Ravioli sandwiches are an unconventional, playful lunch option that taps into the beloved flavors of Italian cuisine while embracing the convenience of a sandwich. These emerged likely in response to the popularity of canned ravioli introduced by Chef Boyardee in the 1930s. The sandwich involves placing canned ravioli, filled with meat or cheese, between slices of bread, which can be toasted or grilled to meld the flavors and add a textural contrast to the soft ravioli filling. Known in some places as Italian sloppy joes or ravioli hero, these sandwiches gained a following among budget-conscious college students and anyone appreciating the melding of comforting Italian flavors with the easy handheld format of a sandwich. Pork cassoulet was what you went for as far as everyday meals go if you wanted to work some pork into the weekly diet. Pork cassoulet featured pork shoulders, or sausages in particular, and some of the typical ingredients you're used to seeing with savory dishes. Tomatoes, onions, garlic, all your usual suspects, except this time it uses white beans like Great Northern beans. The reason you ended a crock pot, particularly for this, is that it is a stew, and the pork needs to be browned. Now you can include breadcrumbs for a crunch on top, but it kind of messes with the stew-centric vibe, so people used to leave them out. As far as the flavor goes, this is all savory, and it does not hide that fact from you at all. The slow cooking really lets everything combine into one massive profile that feels like it's made up of many different flavors, instead of a lot of tastes fighting for which one gets to stand out the most. When this was popular, pork was leagues more affordable than it is today, and the fact that you could either make this into a stew or a casserole meant that a lot of families found a lot of use for it. It fit the tastes of almost every prolific area in the country, like California, the Pacific, or the South, and it did great at keeping everyone full. Tuna Jello. Salad is a striking example of mid-20th century American culinary creativity, combining seemingly incongruous ingredients like canned tuna and lime-flavored gelatin. This dish first emerged in the 1950s, a time when gelatin salads were all the rage. The process involves dissolving lime jello in hot water and mixing it with canned tuna, finely chopped celery, pimento, and hard-boiled eggs, then letting it set until firm. Served on a bed of lettuce and often garnished with dollops of mayonnaise or whipped cream, this salad blends savory and sweet in a mold that is as eye-catching as it is unique. Often featured as the centerpiece at luncheons or as a dinner entree, its unique combination of ingredients and textures made it a memorable, if somewhat unusual, dish. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? All right, let's talk about a real comfort food of the Depression: bean in tomato stew. Beans were a go-to ingredient during the Depression days because of how nutritious, affordable, and versatile they are. It's basically just what it sounds like: beans cooked in a tomato-based broth. But you could also throw in potatoes, carrots, and maybe even a little bit of rice for extra substance. The beans provided a good source of protein and fiber, while the tomato sauce added a burst of flavor. This stew could be enjoyed on its own or served over rice, bread, or even mashed potatoes if you were lucky enough to have them. Originally, Native Americans sweetened baked beans with maple syrup, but then someone decided to turn this protein into a stew, and hey, we're not complaining. It was a filling meal back in the day, and it's still cooked in many households around America where the budget is a bit too tight. I know this dish might sound plain, but believe me, when your belly is rumbling and your pantry is bare, this stew can be a lifesaver. Now, speaking of retro, tuna jelly salad was a really vintage recipe that started coming into the spotlight around the 60s. This was the time when Jell-O and gelatin mold-based dishes were getting really popular. The idea was to use the gelatin mold to encase the tuna with a typical salad dressing, and it really worked back then. I'm not exactly sure how people would react to it now, since I think the idea of a tuna and gelatin crossover is a bit too bold for a lot of people's palates. I could always be wrong though, so you tell me, dear viewer. Would you take a tuna jelly salad to work? Or would you just make a quick run for the nearest Wendy's? I wouldn't blame you at all if you picked the second one. The idea behind salads like these was to throw a spin on an otherwise really boring format of cooking. Salads were okay, but they were never something Americans preferred with their whole hearts. Nowadays, that opinion really started to become public sentiment. Plus, as I was previously talking about, most people would opt for Starbucks now. And I'll tell you this right now, tuna, Jell-O, and caffeine do not go together. Have you ever heard of a boutique food trend? It's apparently food that's small-scale and niche, but innovative and unique, kind of like a local indie band nobody knows about. The early 2000s basically ensured that there was a massive rise in craft food, and that was in large part because of the health scare and the internet. I mean, you get the internet for the first time in your life, you'd want to start blogging everything too. A lot of us did just that, in fact. Plus, artisanal pickles started to be something you would always see at trendy restaurants and also something you'd see for a bit of an unreasonable price at farmers markets. But don't let me discourage you from spending your money. They're now a premium product despite originally being considered cheap pickles you'd eat when there was nothing else around. Mock cuisine in general really saw its heyday during the harsh times of rationing, especially with all the things that were famously eaten before times got so bad like brain. People wanted more of their favorites, even if they had to compromise in some way. And things like mock brains would become really popular as a result. Known for being quite heavy on the seasoning and being laced with fat, they incorporated basic spices like hickory smoke, paprika, and garlic. People would typically have it with a tomato sauce if they could spare the ingredients, and it definitely scratched that itch that lots of US meat lovers were having around the nation. Another meatless option, lima bean and peanut loaf, was a creative way to get your protein during the Depression. It's made by combining cooked lima beans, peanut butter, and breadcrumbs to form a loaf. The result was a savory loaf with a nutty flavor and a satisfying texture. It was an excellent meatless option for families looking to stretch their food budget. Plus, it was a great way to use up leftover beans and peanuts, ensuring nothing went to waste. Lima bean loaf allegedly tastes a bit like falafel, but is best with lots of highly seasoned gravy. This dish might sound a bit unusual, but it was a creative solution to a common problem: getting enough protein without emptying their pockets. Back in the day, when you were out of just about everything except sugar, flour, and fruit, a vinegar cobbler was your only option. No surprise that it was also known as one of the famous desperation pies. Desperation pies are pies in American cuisine made using staple ingredients like butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and any other ingredients that cooks had on hand to complement them or substitute for ingredients that were out of season or too expensive. These pies were more common before refrigeration and canned pie fillings, and during times of hardship like the Great Depression and rationing of World War II. When fresh fruits were hard to come by, people turned to vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruits like apples and lemons. This cobbler used a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices to create a filling that, when baked, tasted surprisingly similar to a fruit cobbler. Instead of chunks of fresh apples, those on a budget would use apple cider vinegar to fake the acidic taste. The crust was made from basic pantry staples like flour, sugar, and butter or lard. The dish reportedly tasted like a custard made from salt and vinegar chips, a rare dessert that leaves the roof of your mouth tingling. Octopus is actually one I bet you've never really heard about before. Octopus used to be considered a food that was pretty much a last resort. It was something that coastal peasants and fishermen ate when they had literally nothing else. It started to turn into a delicacy thanks to Japanese sushi and Italian seafood dishes. But man, it was really underrated. Octopus was considered super difficult to cook. You had to either dry it, or pound it, or slow simmer it, and it was really rubbery. The texture was foreign to a lot of people, so that's why they only ate it when there was nothing else. And naturally, if that's all you do, then that's the association you build. It became synonymous with bad times. It wasn't until lots of restaurants started doing things like pulpo a la gallega, which is a popular Spanish dish, and things like takoyaki and reductions that octopus started to gain respect in gourmet circles. So this is a bit of a tricky name to pronounce even when you give it a genuine try, but it's worth knowing about this dish because of how good it is. Ballymaloe Irish lamb stew is something that comes all the way from County Cork, and lamb stew is something that Americans welcome with very open arms. You can particularly find this dish being spread in droves around St. Patrick's Day in any Irish-American community. Whether you're in New Hampshire or Rhode Island, which even today have a pretty solid amount of Irishmen living in them, you're bound to run into a Ballymaloe stew once in a while. Despite how good of a stew it is, with tender carrots, potatoes, and tender strips of lamb, and how simple the preparation is since it relies mostly on the natural flavors present in the ingredients, this dish actually flopped once before. Well, I wouldn't say it was a true flop, but it did fade out of the memory of the general public before too. That was before the 20th century, but ever since then it has been seeing a bit of a revival thanks to social media and Ballymaloe House, which is what it's named after. Either way, this is one of the best recipes to ever come out of a family cookbook. And if you've ever had one while at an Irish friend's home, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. So far, we have two solid options for salads with a sandwich variation for one of them, but what if you do not like protein in your salads? Want them on the sweeter, more dessert-y side? Then molded cranberry orange salads have your name written on them wrapped up in a bow. Some normal or raspberry gelatin and frozen cranberries, plus apples and oranges cut into wedges, would make for an incredibly sweet and delightful salad that had everything you wanted in it taste-wise. It also did wonders for your skin with a steady supply of vitamins and the benefits of cranberries. So not only would grandmothers make this for their beloved families, but they would sneak a bowl on the side for themselves too. Despite the ingredients being relatively easy to get, this was more of an upper-class dish popular in affluent areas. If life hands you corn cobs, make jelly. This creation of the Dust Bowl is the best example of use it or else it will be used on you. Indeed, in the old days when food was hard to come by, one could not even discard corn cobs. Yes, the very same cobs that you discarded in the bin today were used to make a sweet golden jelly that was related to honey in taste. The process was simple. Take the cobs, boil them to get the corn starchy goodness, add sugar and pectin, and you have corn cob jelly. It was inexpensive, convenient, and could be slathered on the constant companion of the Depression: bread. The taste? Light and sweet with a very subtle corn taste. And let's face it, when you are living off of crumbs, any type of jelly is a treat. Corn cob jelly may not sound like a dish that could be eaten today, but during that period, it was the best invention to solve a real issue. Everyone wanted to get as much use out of every kernel of corn as was humanly possible, figuratively and literally. Now it is a recipe that one might find in a rustic fare or a book of curious recipes, but in the past, it was a true example of people's creativity. At the very least, corn cob jelly makes us remember that life is a little sweeter when it's as corny as it is sweet. Up next, we have a dish that was all about making the most out of simple ingredients: spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole. It can be argued that Eleanor Roosevelt did the best she could during the Great Depression. The First Lady promoted dishes to encourage savvy homemakers, such as a casserole made from spaghetti, boiled carrots, and a simple white sauce of milk, flour, salt, and butter. The spaghetti had to be cooked for 25 minutes. The idea was to get the noodles mushy so they paired nicely with the boiled carrots and a penny's worth of creamy sauce. The result? A vehicle for nutrition and nutrients. Families loved this dish because it was versatile and could easily be modified based on what was available. It was a great way to fill up hungry bellies without breaking the bank. It still makes a pretty delicious meal for potlucks, so if you want to impress everyone with something easy to whip up, the spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole will do. Cold fried chicken wasn't exactly what the name makes it sound like. You can't really cold fry something, obviously, but what you can do is serve fried chicken that's been chilled, or fried chicken that's at least at room temperature. See, this was something that got popular at picnics, and it was a way for people to get rid of leftovers when they didn't have microwaves. As you might know, fried chicken tends to lose a lot of its charm when you just warm it up on a pan and stove. Now, I'm no one to judge, but that's just not how you do it. Naturally, though, if you don't have a microwave, that's where your head would go, and a lot of people just didn't back then. So, what's the next step? Do we bite the bullet and eat that delicious fried chicken cold or at room temperature? Or do we warm it up and lose a lot of the bang for buck value that comes with a 3-piece combo for like $2 or $3? Most people stuck with the first option. Cold fried chicken would also be good as a work lunch because it was an easy way to get rid of your leftovers if you didn't feel like eating it at home, plus it was super quick. Just grab the fried chicken, box it, and go. You had your work lunch for that day sorted. It caught on a lot more than you'd think, really. Remember when we said that there are salads that use spinaches and kale? Welcome to the wedge salad, which uses spinach, lettuce, and kale with a blue cheese dressing to make one of the most impeccable salads you have ever had. If a home cook ever wanted to stun the crowd at a summer party or a Thanksgiving lunch, this wedge salad was the go-to option for stealing the show. Plus, the best part was that it was ready in just about 15 minutes. For the finish, you would sprinkle tomatoes, onion, and bacon on each part of the salad to add a delightful and much-needed crunch to go along with the greens. Would you try this? It certainly meets a lot of health needs that people have. Taste the innovation in every hearty bite of Jiffy ground beef cornbread casserole, a triumph of American home cooking. Rising to popularity in the mid-20th century, this casserole marries seasoned ground beef with the simplicity of Jiffy cornbread mix, a product that became a staple in American kitchens following its introduction in the 1930s by the Chelsea Milling Company. The preparation involves browning ground beef with onions, garlic, and a medley of spices, then layering it in a baking dish, topping it with a batter made from the iconic cornbread mix. Once baked, the casserole presents a delightful contrast of flavors and textures, with golden cornbread capping a juicy, flavorful beef base. It became a favored choice for an easy and satisfying meal, perfectly blending ease of preparation with hearty flavors. You hear the name rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world, since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil, a dash of salt, and you were good to go at basically no cost. To be honest, same deal with corned beef and cabbage wraps. The thing with sandwiches is that, as good as they were, most people really were trying to get onto that health parade that was taking over. It wasn't just a trend or a niche movement you'd only find in states that voted blue. It was something even the anti-vaxxers were getting behind. And if you can get those people to think about their health, you know we're either at rock bottom or approaching it. Corned beef and cabbage wraps were supposed to be familiar ground, while also being healthy enough that you could eat them every day. Plus, lots of people had grown pretty accustomed to eating cabbage thanks to victory gardens, which were just makeshift gardens you would have in your backyard during the Depression and grow crops out of. These were actually really good too, and with canned corned beef becoming a widespread item in most stores, it was only easier to make at home. Even someone who couldn't cook could just make and assemble this on their own. If there's one sandwich you can never go wrong with, it's the old-fashioned grilled cheese sandwich. This one is the epitome of comfort food, and Grandma's version was a childhood favorite. Even the pickiest eaters used to beg for this one. So this one became popular during the Great Depression era, when we had to make do with three of the most common ingredients in our pantries: bread, cheese, and butter. Now, some of us used to get creative with our grilled cheese by adding extras like sliced tomatoes, ham, bacon, or even pickles. But this one was best enjoyed simple and plain. Oh, and let's not forget, it tastes even better when paired with a warm bowl of tomato soup. Before burgers and fries, grilled cheese and tomato soup used to be the ultimate food combo of our dreams. The best part? Most cheese sandwiches are vegetarian and can easily be made vegan by adjusting the type of cheese and oil. Forget the meat aisle. What do you do when there's no meat? You make mock sausage. As you might have guessed, there was not exactly an abundance of food during the Dust Bowl era, so people started to experiment. The mock sausage was a mashup of anything remotely sausage adjacent: meals, flour, grains, breads, spices, and perhaps a little oil if you were fortunate. To make it, you would combine these simple ingredients into a paste, form it into patties similar to sausage, and then fry. The result? A breakfast sausage knockoff of sorts. But come on, nobody was ever deceived here. Nevertheless, the spices did their job, and in the worst of circumstances, one must do the worst of things. They ate mock sausage with whatever was available: bread, beans, or boiled greens, and it was a regular part of survival food. The mock sausage was not only about feeding people, but also about maintaining everyday life's appearance. It provided families an opportunity to consume something that at least resembled something they used to know. What is even more astonishing is how these recipes sustained spirits, and how it is possible for flavor not to disappear even when the ingredients have. Today, mock sausage is quite popular in the vegan and vegetarian community. But back then, it was about making a meal out of every single grain you had and ensuring that it was filling. This is what you can say about making the impossible possible. Forget the meat aisle. What do you do when there's no meat? You make mock sausage. As you might have guessed, there was not exactly an abundance of food during the Dust Bowl era, so people started to experiment. The mock sausage was a mashup of anything remotely sausage adjacent: meals, flour, grains, breads, spices, and perhaps a little oil if you were fortunate. To make it, you would combine these simple ingredients into a paste, form it into patties similar to sausage, and then fry. The result? A breakfast sausage knockoff of sorts. But come on, nobody was ever deceived here. Nevertheless, the spices did their job, and in the worst of circumstances, one must do the worst of things. They ate mock sausage with whatever was available: bread, beans, or boiled greens, and it was a regular part of survival food. The mock sausage was not only about feeding people, but also about maintaining everyday life's appearance. It provided families an opportunity to consume something that at least resembled something they used to know. What is even more astonishing is how these recipes sustained spirits, and how it is possible for flavor not to disappear even when the ingredients have. Today, mock sausage is quite popular in the vegan and vegetarian community. But back then, it was about making a meal out of every single grain you had and ensuring that it was filling. This is what you can say about making the impossible possible. Rice salad with curry dressing is probably the epitome of the whole health consciousness movement that dominated so much of the second half of the 90s. Rice salad with curry dressing would also often be made with much healthier ingredients than what people were used to, such as brown rice, quinoa, and more. Bell peppers, cucumbers, and spinach were also popular ingredients to throw in there. To be honest, it's a bit like a chicken katsu curry rice bowl, but without the katsu curry or the fried chicken fillets. This was something we took inspiration from a lot of different cultures from. One of the most popular ones was the Mediterranean version, which really emphasized the use of olives. But people also tried spicier Spanish recipes or more tame and flavorful Italian ones. There were all kinds of ways to have your rice salad, but it was dishes like these that set the stage for curries to become a main, trendy food in America. Once something starts being a work lunch, you know it's made it to the big leagues. It summarizes a lot of what was going on in the 90s too. A push for more healthier food, a strong desire for transportable, easier-to-make recipes, and a fusion of different cultures, recipes, and ideas to basically create uncharted territory. Its golden days from the 20th century aren't something we have anymore, but it's still a knockout option to go for if you're trying to switch your lunch up a little. If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right. Those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available, no need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. So, this next sandwich is also typically made from only 3 ingredients, but it's still one of Grandma's most iconic creations. I'm talking about the infamous BLT sandwich. The name is an abbreviation for the ingredients: bacon, lettuce, and tomato. This sandwich was a summertime favorite, especially when tomatoes were at their ripest in Graham's garden. The BLT's roots can be traced back to tea sandwiches served in the late 19th century, but it wasn't until World War II when it gained popularity. During this time, supermarkets made bacon, lettuce, and tomatoes more widely available all year round, and Grandma made sure to use them up in the kitchen. A classic BLT is often made with mayonnaise, but some purists argue that the sandwich should be spread with butter instead. Well, it's still up for debate, so make sure to let us know your take on it in the comments. So, this next sandwich is also typically made from only 3 ingredients, but it's still one of Grandma's most iconic creations. I'm talking about the infamous BLT sandwich. The name is an abbreviation for the ingredients: bacon, lettuce, and tomato. This sandwich was a summertime favorite, especially when tomatoes were at their ripest in Graham's garden. The BLT's roots can be traced back to tea sandwiches served in the late 19th century, but it wasn't until World War II when it gained popularity. During this time, supermarkets made bacon, lettuce, and tomatoes more widely available all year round, and Grandma made sure to use them up in the kitchen. A classic BLT is often made with mayonnaise, but some purists argue that the sandwich should be spread with butter instead. Well, it's still up for debate, so make sure to let us know your take on it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe and let us know if you ever came across any of these meals. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup. Especially in the winters, when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. So you know how America and pulled pork go together like jam on toast, right? After all, it's something you can feed a whole crowd and have them feeling full and satisfied. It's a showstopper, but you can make a lot of easy things with it. Most dishes you can make and serve will have people asking you what your recipe is, but that's just how easy pulled pork is to work with. So, when I say this next sentence, hear it with an open mind. How do you feel about cherry cola pulled pork? Yeah, slow-cooked, barbecue-y, savory pulled pork left to simmer in a pool of cherry cola, barbecue sauce, and other seasonings. The first time I heard of this dish, I struggled just to imagine all of those flavors in one bite. Like, barbecue sauce is a dip, pulled pork is a main dish, and cherry cola is a drink. You're used to having all that separately, right? Despite that, since it was all made from things that were so readily available in most homes, and since it was right up the alley of home chefs in their slow cooking era, it took off in a major way. Especially in the South, where everything involved in this dish is something people were already having on a daily basis. Bubble and squeak was something that completely fit the situations most people would find themselves in during the war, because this dish is all about the leftovers. Usually, Sunday dinner's leftovers would be used in a bubble and squeak to make sure nothing went to waste. Plus, people would definitely take that sentiment to heart when it came to holiday dinners where there were enough things left to constitute at least 2 or 3 meals the next day. Usually, this dish is made with potatoes and cabbage and is fried, so it goes properly and amazingly with some potato flotties or other items on the list. Maybe you can take a note from people's books the next time you think you have nothing to eat, but plenty of things still left in the fridge. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy-flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store, if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. For families with little more than pantry staples, stretching a meal was an art form. Tomato gravy. Over rice was a perfect example of how a handful of cheap ingredients could be turned into something warm, filling, and, on the right day, even delicious. Rice was affordable, easy to store, and could be cooked in large batches, making it a go-to base for struggling households. The tomato gravy itself was a simple mix of canned or fresh tomatoes, flour for thickening, and a little fat, usually bacon grease or lard, to give it depth. Some versions were smooth, others chunky, depending on what was on hand. When money was especially tight, even just tomato juice and water could create a thinner, more soup-like version. This dish had roots in the South, where tomato gravy was often served over biscuits. But during the Depression, rice became a common substitute since it was cheaper and stretched further. Leftovers weren't wasted either. Extra gravy could be poured over cornbread or mixed into the next day's meal. It was proof that a little creativity could turn a sparse pantry into a meal that still felt like home. Deli classics have always been Graham's specialty, and the corned beef sandwich was no exception. This one started out as a nod to the traditions of Eastern European cuisine and became popular in the United States in the early 20th century. In case you're wondering about the name, corned beef comes from the curing process. Corned refers to the large grains of salt that are used to preserve the meat. This was a pretty simple beef sandwich with a hint of mustard, but its taste really spoke for itself. And it even made its way into pop culture by being frequently featured in TV shows, movies, etc. For example, in the film The Godfather, there's a memorable scene where a character is shown eating a corned beef sandwich. If you've seen the movie, I'm sure you remember it. We're going to take a bit of a deep dive into a cuisine that we haven't really explored before. I'm talking about caponata, which is a very traditional Sicilian dish that goes all the way back to the 18th century. It's supposed to be a sailor's dish. Can you believe that? It got that reputation attached to it because the birthplace of caponata was Sicily. There's no specific restaurant or name that's credited with making it, but if you ever went there, you'd know just how much the people appreciate this. The first time this became popular in America was when Mediterranean cuisine and Italian immigrants were mixing together and creating all sorts of new dishes, as well as bringing old familiar ones from their homeland. The best part about this dish for a lot of people was that it gave a chance to a vegetable, which otherwise people just aren't too fond of. I mean, eggplants aren't really the most main course-worthy idea you could think of, right? Pair that up with some tomatoes, onions, olives, and capers and cook it in vinegar, sugar, and olive oil. Make a nice little traditional agrodolce sauce, and you'll get this extremely earthy dish with a lot of complex flavors going for it. People that grew up during World War II will know that mixing sawdust with bread to fortify it so that your supply would last twice as long is not quite the urban myth it is made out to be today, but rather a sad fact of a dark time that people would prefer to leave in the past. This was something born purely out of necessity and a lack of basic necessities like flour. Since it was becoming so scarce across America, people's supplies of bread were running out fast and often. Bread was the only thing families had to eat too. With even that comfort gone, people took to mixing sawdust, which you could even taste in the bread. In some cases, it made the bread go bad faster, such as people when used too much of it. But in most other appliances of this technique, it worked as a filler when nothing else could be used as one. This would also set up a trend of consuming fiber in the 70s, even though most companies used cellulose fiber that was made from sawdust. So it actually does have quite a history in America. The phrase mock crab salad sandwich might invoke images of cheap sandwiches that were built to just look like a crab sandwich, but if I've earned your trust at all so far, then keep an open mind because this is actually a wonderful example of American ingenuity. So, mock food came out as a result of the Depression. Most people just couldn't really afford things like crab or red meat or any kind of meat, really. I mean, with the war rationing and everything, you pretty much had what you could hunt in the wild and the cheap cuts of meat that no one would really buy. Mock food was a way for people to get some flavors they were sorely missing. It stayed a long while even after the Depression, since thanks to urbanization, there were less and less coastal cities, bodies of water, and more. Otherwise, there used to be a time where crab was so abundant that it was cheap. Anyway, for this mock food imitation, what people would do is use cod or haddock instead, and the salad was just a basic mayo celery mix with French or vinegar dressing. You'd lay that on some soft rolls, and you'd actually have a pretty good dish. The thing is, mock food culture is entirely a thing of the past now, and most of these recipes have been lost. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Macaroni salad with ham cubes is a really nostalgic one. If you look at it from the lens of what was popular in the era at the time, then yeah, sure, macaroni salads were a perfect middle ground between healthier, leaner bowls of salads and the typical macaroni and cheese meals we were all used to. People thought they had to get started somewhere, and well, why not get it going with something you know you can stand? If you look at it historically, then macaroni salad actually goes all the way back to European dishes like pasta fredda, and in the early 20th century, let's say around the 20s and 30s, it was a really popular meal to have as a side dish. During the Depression, it became a staple because you could make so much of it in large batches and still get everyone fed and taken care of. Now, in the war era, the rise of convenience foods meant that mayonnaise and macaroni were getting even more popular and accessible than ever before. It was only natural that people would start adopting macaroni salads, but they needed something to go with it. Some oomph, you know? That definitely came from the smokiness of the ham cubes, which honestly bounced really well off of the macaroni. This salad was a typical lunch in factories, offices, and just about any kind of labor-intensive job you could imagine. It's just a bit sad that people have gone back to Kraft's mac and cheese boxes now, though. On the other hand, stuffed bell peppers were an American classic, especially in places like the South. The idea was really similar to the egg-stuffed salad tomatoes I was talking about. Even then, I told you how it's more or less like these bell peppers. The idea here this time was to hollow these peppers out and fill them in with things like rice, tomato sauce, and ground meat. They were also the perfect thing to take to work, because you could carry them in just about anything. The more transportable something was, the better it would function as a work lunch. Stuffed bell peppers also had the extra effect of giving you a boost of energy, which was always really nice because desk jobs, as I'm sure all of you might be familiar with, can suck the soul out of you. The reason these were popular in the South is because it's arguably the home of stuffed peppers and all variants of them. Those people love their spice, man. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. Now, this might be an odd pairing to a lot of you, but peanut butter and bacon sandwiches really did hit. Hey, some of you who are 90s kids might even remember. This was basically one of the best lunches you could get, and to be honest, I still think a lot of people do make this even if it's not as popular as it used to be. It was just a flawless idea in concept and execution. Take 2 slices of bread, a dash of peanut butter, and some perfectly well-fried strips of bacon. It's genius. Throw in some iceberg mayo and whatever else it is you like and whatever keeps you going throughout that miserable shift, and you have yourself a full-sized snack and meal. This was basically the reason why this dish got so popular. You could even make 2 of these and still make your daily subway or bus ride if you were living in crowded urban centers. Plus, there was just so much room for variety with a dish like this that a lot of people didn't see the point in changing it up. However, that coffee work culture thing I was talking about is unfortunately a real phenomenon. Somewhere along the line, people really started to abandon the idea of having a solid meal at all for lunch, and I think you only see older workers who were raised in the 20th century still having things like this. I know for a fact you've all grown up on some of your grandparents' baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was, but what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? Handmade butter used to be a really simple kitchen staple at home, and it started to be reborn as a gourmet product when people really got into the crafts and works aspect of it. See, people like things they made on their own. It gives them a chance to show off on Instagram, it gives them something to talk about with their friends, or it just becomes something cool to speak about on a date. You know, a cute and quirky little fact about yourself that helps break the ice. Besides that, there's also the authenticity and uniqueness of a completely 100% homegrown and homemade product. In a world full of preservatives, food dyes, artificial flavorings, and added vitamins and minerals, something that's actually just made out of the stuff God put on earth and nothing else is a relief. The revival of artisanal butter throughout the 2000s to today was really helpful in giving it a new image. High-end restaurants started serving cultured butters, and they even started putting hand-churned ones up for sale. There was a premium price you had to pay, but man, the suburban moms fell for it so bad. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Egg drop soup sounds a little fancier than it is, but have you never had a simple dish that knocked the socks off of you? Just a 2 or 3 ingredient show that really hit home, ticked every box, and left you with a smile? Egg drop soup was a lot like that. It was just diced potatoes and onions, which might get you thinking of the pie we just went over, but this is more like a broth. If chicken broth was there, then of course that was the foundation, but water worked too. Once the potatoes started cooking, you would drizzle some scrambled eggs before adding whole ones. It might look lumpy and score a little less for presentation, but it deserves a solid A+ just for the taste alone, especially if you would pair it with some leftover bread. Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a Brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the Brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The Brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like Apple Betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. Okay, this next one sounds like some kind of alien food, but Milcorno was a Depression-era kitchen miracle. It was a government-invented mixture of cornmeal and dried milk powder, designed to be a cheap and nutritious substitute for more expensive foods. A research team led by Flora Rose developed Milcorno, Milkowato, and Milkweedo cereals in the early 1930s, and they were sold exclusively to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration for distribution to Americans impoverished by the Depression. It was claimed that by substituting Milcorno for flour and cornmeal, a family of 5 could eat for less than $5 a week. The best part about Milcorno was its versatility. You could use it as a base for porridge, bake it into cornbread, or even use it to thicken soups. And while it might not sound super exciting, Milcorno dishes could actually be pretty tasty with the right seasonings and a bit of creativity. With the rise of delicious cereals, there's no room for it in our diets now, but hey, no one's going to judge you if you want to give it a try. Roosevelt coffee was a beverage that people both created and drank much more out of necessity than commonly shared caffeine preferences or a newly acquired taste. People needed to make their coffee rations last as long as possible, and one trick they found out that greatly extended the duration of a batch was to reuse grounds. With the US already rationing coffee to a pound per household every 5 weeks, things were rough. The end product was a thin and watery drink that tasted close enough to a fresh cup while taking the real worries of spending more than they were able to on coffee off of people's shoulders. Honestly, it was not that bad either, and it was named Roosevelt coffee in honor of the president if you wanted some historical trivia to spice the drink up further. If you ever find yourself not being able to get some fresh grounds, maybe try making a batch of this and see how you find it. You may be just as surprised as Americans back then with each sip. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Wild rice has a vivid history. It used to be a vital survival crop for a lot of different native American tribes, but later it was dismissed by a lot of settlers. They thought it wasn't really worth the work and that there were better grains to start planting. Indigenous tribes like the Ojibwe and the Sioux felt differently though, as they had grown up depending on the grain. Now, it was not until the middle of the 20th century that food enthusiasts really started to discover the deep and rich flavor of wild rice. There was also the unique texture, and it being a tribe staple was basically helping with the exotic food reputation it was making for itself. Wild rice really does have a lot of decent benefits, though. It's a lot higher in protein than any other kind of rice, and it's also something that works really well in gourmet soups, pilafs, and rice bowls. It became a huge part of farm-to-table cuisine, and wild rice was now commercially farmed instead of being harvested by hand. Basically, they gentrified the thing. Speaking of those times, another really good source of protein was catfish, and one of the best ways to have it was fried catfish with hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. Along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a Southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did, though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. This is going to be an interesting one. Over the course of your life, you've probably never lived in a time where caviar wasn't worth at least a week's paycheck. It's one of the world's most expensive delicacies now, but it actually used to be an everyday food for a lot of fishermen back in the day, especially Russian and Parisian ones. That's just some... Duck fat might be an odd one to you because what would people need to be doing with that, right? But, well, before refrigeration, different kinds of fats made up a big part of people's preservation methods. This was true in America up until the 1900s, when industrialization basically meant that there were just better ways of preserving things like canning, even if refrigeration hadn't come around yet. When it did, people just thought to do away with it entirely, since it became redundant. In the 2000s, though, there was a bit of a resurgence of interest in a lot of America's food circles thanks to chefs like Thomas Keller. High restaurants and farm-to-table places that had become local names were rendering duck fat on their own as a part of their marketing, too. It added to the air of exclusiveness, and duck fat was something that people were also beginning to argue was better than either butter or lard. Something about it having more monounsaturated fats. Either way, if you know the science about it, please do share in the comments. But that's pretty much how duck fat started to turn itself around and become a popular cooking fat once again, and I got to say, that's pretty humble. It stuck to its roots the whole time. Boiled cactus pads, or as they're also called, nopales. In the days when the pantry was bare and the garden was dust, people turned to the desert for dinner. To think that someone looked at a prickly cactus and thought, "Yep, let's eat that." Necessity is the mother of invention, and nopales proved to be surprisingly edible and nutritious. The pads were stripped of their needles, carefully and boiled until tender, and had a tangy, almost lemony taste. They would chop them up, season them with whatever spices they had left, and serve them as a side dish. They were even thrown into stews, where their slimy texture acted as a natural thickener. It wasn't anyone's first choice, but when it came to survival, boiled cactus was a blessing in disguise. Fast forward to today, and nopales are a delicacy in Mexican cuisine. During the Dust Bowl, they weren't about taste, they were about survival. Those desperate cooks never imagined what they saw as hardship food would one day be served in trendy restaurants. Cactus pads proved that even in hard times, resourcefulness can take ouch and turn it into yum. A more simple breakfast to get people's day started was creamed peas on toast. Look, lots of homes could only use so much butter, and spices like cinnamon or other toppings very popular with toast nowadays were definitely out of the question. People still need a good kick to get their Monday in motion, and these peas were not only a wonderful source of protein, but the cream on the toast made for a filling breakfast too. There was a massive emphasis in World War II on dishes that prioritized nutrition while keeping you full, or as full as you could get. In America, every household was more than willing to compromise a bit on flavor, elegance, or presentation in exchange for more practical food that still tasted all right. Creamed peas on toast understood the assignment perfectly and fit the bill. Yes, you heard it here first, skunk stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten, not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum. Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. Forage mushrooms didn't always lining our burgers and topping our pizzas. For a majority of its history, it was really just something people ate when things were super bad. There was nothing to eat, and people basically just had to forage for whatever they could. The most popular of this was the button mushroom, but they definitely tried to forage as much as they could. Now, despite this, mushrooms were still considered really low class. People had just begun to associate it with nothing but poverty and hard times. It wasn't until the middle and the later end of the 20th century that mushrooms started to become a classic topping you'd see on not just burgers and pizzas, but steaks, chicken dishes, sandwiches, and all kinds of soups and stews. Basically, it's a mushroom world, and we're just living in it now. A big part of this is how canned mushrooms became so accessible. Another reason is that an interest in European cuisine led to a massive boom in cream of soups and cream of mushroom soups. Share some of your favorite mushrooms with us right now in the comments. Bacon. Crackers, I mean, sure, they're pretty good even as a typical easygoing breakfast, but what do we really do here? You eat something enough times, you tend to get used to it and get bored. How do you get around that? Well, since the topic is retro dishes, we used to hear a lot about bacon bow tie crackers back in the day. It was something you could find for breakfast or a cocktail appetizer, which is some serious versatility. The crackers were extra crispy since they were wrapped inside bacon and then baked until the bacon itself was pretty crispy. It was the perfect combo, and all they needed was each other to realize that. It was smoky but sweet. It was also savory, but buttery smooth and not dry at all. Dishes that are such neat little combinations like these are often hiding right under your nose, and if we didn't have the imagination of so many home chefs who found these and got them into the public sphere, then we'd be a lot more tasteless as a country. Eggless sponge cakes might be a concept that you cannot imagine or wrap your head around today, but back then a lot of people skipped the eggs entirely. What people used instead were margarine, sugar, and syrups to get the same vibe. What you got was a crowd entirely in favor of a sponge cake that was airy, fluffy, and made the best of your resources. Wartime brings out the frugality in everyone, but in this case it brought out the inner baker with a quick fix or workaround for everything. If you did not have ingredients or could not spare them, then you did not have to worry. You could still enjoy a yummy dessert with your family, and this is a testament to human creativity and how even the bleakest of situations can never kill your sweet tooth. Bean soup is different from the other soups on our list because, in contrast, bean soup was pretty simple to make. Dried red kidney beans in a thick soup made for a favorite of states like Idaho, where the dish originated from. You could find different ideas on the soup from house to house, as some had their vegetables as toppings and others had meats. Fred Dubois, who was Idaho's senator at one point, passed a bill that mandated the Senate restaurant to have bean soup on the menu every day. Definitely one way to start a movement if you ask us, but the trend definitely stuck around after it gained steam. It was an amazing way for low-income neighborhoods to eat healthy, but nowadays you would not find it in households as beans are not really the go-to item for soups. When it comes to sandwiches, only a few were as satisfying as the roast beef sandwich. So, many sandwiches were originally created as a clever way to repurpose leftovers, and this one was no exception. Roast beef sandwiches often started with leftovers from Sunday dinner. The Sunday roast was a time-honored tradition, and any extra beef was used to make delicious sandwiches for lunch the next day. In 1900, the dish was described by the Washington Post as unattractive and as a tired ark in a gravy flood. However, it gained popularity in the coming years when Grandma decided to take matters into her own hands, and by 1931, some critics even went as far as to describe it as a true taste of South Dakota. The bread for Grandma's roast beef sandwich was often homemade, and boy did she know how to dress it up. Whether it was a dollop of horseradish sauce, a spread of mustard, or a smear of mayonnaise, Gram knew exactly what it needed, and if we got lucky, she even snuck in a slice of cheese. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. Croque madames involve layers of melted cheese smothered between freshly baked, crisp white bread. And to top it all off, there's an intense, smoky flavor from the ham. The best part about it is that it takes minutes to make, and it was one of the more fancy dishes that people would create when they were feeling like having a bit of an extravagant dinner. Everyone deserves to treat themselves sometimes, but for home chefs, especially grandparents, the biggest treat is often just seeing everyone eat up every last bite of what they've made. That was never a problem if croque madames were the dish being served, because nobody could resist this classic American sandwich that did more than its fair share of justice to ham. Poached or lightly fried eggs as a topping also made it work a lot better. And by the way, they are called croque madames because the poached eggs seem to resemble women's luxury hats in the 90s. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. If you believe that using every part of the animal is a modern concept, you are mistaken. Dust Bowl families were not sparing any part of the pig, including the snout. Pig snouts breaded might sound like something you dare a friend to eat, but during the Great Depression, it was a delicacy. When meat was a rare commodity, the snout was a cheap source of something meaty, chewy, and quite palatable. The snouts were washed, cooked until soft, and then breaded before being deep fried to golden brown. The result? A crispy, crispy outside and a very tasty meat on the inside. Well, yes, the texture may have been somewhat unusual, but when you are hungry, you don't mind. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. To Dust Bowl families, pig snouts breaded were not just edibles, but a way to pay tribute to every pound of what little they had. No part was wasted, while such meals ensured that scarcity became resourcefulness. Nowadays, breaded pig snouts can be found only in some culinary forums, but they are a vivid example of how people tried to feed themselves when there were no chips, but snouts. Would I try it? To put it in perspective, if my grandma was to prepare it with a wink and a smile, I'd be willing to take a bite. Indeed, when you survive, you become brave and perhaps a little curious. But would you try it? Leave us the answer in the comments below. While we're on the topic of bizarre, meaty meals, hog's head cheese is another crazy one on the list. Now, don't let the name confuse you because the meal doesn't contain any cheese or in fact any dairy products at all. It is made with flesh from the head of a pig, typically set in aspic and usually eaten cold, at room temperature, or in a sandwich. The parts of the head used do not commonly include the brain, eyes, or ears, but everything else? It's all in there somewhere. This unique meat jelly originated somewhere in ancient Germany and instantly made its way to other parts of Europe. Many recipes use a bit of lemon juice to add a bit more flavor to the jelly. This sandwich would go great with some fresh fruit fluff salad, which was perfect for all kinds of occasions. Casual brunches, bridal showers, birthdays, and holiday gatherings all felt a little incomplete in the northern areas of America without this fruit fluff salad. It was a pretty good summer dish, and it had an assortment of fruits that worked well and bounced off of each other's textures and tastes. Stuff like a creamy lemon base supplemented with fresh strawberries or blueberries was a typical standard for a fresh fruit fluff salad. but you could also get tropical with kiwis and pineapples. A lot of things worked, and the reason it goes great with a croquet madame is because ham was usually used as a topping for this dish too, so it was a great pairing. Not used to hearing, and the idea of beef tongue in general might be icky to some. Still, keep your minds open because the people back then definitely had to, and what they found out was that it is not so bad. Maybe you might be in for a culinary shakeup too? Either way, braised beef tongue was quite a popular dish that would typically be served in a casserole-like manner during World War II. Due to the war, it was very difficult for families to acquire the meats they were typically used to having, and beef tongue was rubbery and tough, but it was the best they could get. Braising it made for a softer bite and a lot of flavor, so you had all your protein and nutrition needs ticked off cheap and easy. That was a lot more than you could expect during wartime. Handmade butter used to be a really simple kitchen staple at home, and it started to be reborn as a gourmet product when people really got into the crafts and works aspect of it. See, people like things they made on their own. It gives them a chance to show off on Instagram, it gives them something to talk about with their friends, or it just becomes something cool to speak about on a date. You know, a cute and quirky little fact about yourself that helps break the ice. Besides that, there's also the authenticity and uniqueness of a completely 100% homegrown and homemade product. In a world full of preservatives, food dyes, artificial flavorings, and added vitamins and minerals, something that's actually just made out of the stuff God put on Earth and nothing else is a relief. The revival of artisanal butter throughout the 2000s to today was really helpful in giving it a new image. High-end restaurants started serving cultured butters, and they even started putting hand-churned ones up for sale. There was a premium price you had to pay, but man, the suburban moms fell for it so bad. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. If people can make an entire fake fish fillet and still be pretty satisfied with it, then other meaty wonders like liver definitely are not too far off the horizon, and chopped liver substitute would eventually prove that right. Something that became incredibly popular in the war-torn landscape of America because all it took was some onions, green lentils, walnuts, and salt and pepper. You had to make a paste out of it to get the texture of chopped liver down, and in terms of taste, this was a completely new experience, yet a significantly cheaper and easier one. It was much easier to get ingredients like these than good quality liver back then, and a lot of citizens stuck with this recipe even after the dust settled because they liked how healthy of an alternative it was. There are only a few specific cuts of the cow that are really prized in value. Brisket doesn't happen to be one of them. It comes from the chest, and that's full of really tough muscle and really chewy connective tissue. Meaning that historically, this was a meat eater's last resort, or one of them. Now, braising brisket helped make it tender, but a lot of people thought it was just too much effort for not enough buck. I can't really explain how the next 10 seconds happened historically because sometimes these trends just explode, but I can narrate it all to you. After the people were over braising it, Texas ranchers and Mexican cowboys began smoking brisket, and barbecue joints all over Texas took note and tried their own spin by smoking it for hours on wood. Texas slowly became known for this, and after World War II, it became a full-blown Texas barbecue Hall of Famer. You had people in Austin, Lockhart, and Houston going balls to the wall insane over the delicious taste of this, upper, middle, and lower class alike. The barbecue joints didn't really miss out on that. They raised their prices accordingly, and brisket actually happened to triple or quadruple in markets. This used to be a bargain meat you would try your best to get rid of, and it actually became the reason why a lot of butchers' families got to eat good meat later on. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Okay, this one is a bit of a curveball, cold milk soup. But hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. Cold milk soup was a Depression-era staple, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This dish has Amish origins and was one of the most popular meals back in the day. It was also pretty simple to whip up. Take some milk, mix in sliced bananas, a bit of sugar, and sometimes even bread or other fruits. And there you have it, cold milk soup. It might not sound like much, but for many families, this was a quick and easy way to get some calories and nutrients, especially when fresh ingredients were hard to come by. The bananas added some natural sweetness, while the milk provided protein and fat. It was a simple, no-cook meal that could be thrown together in minutes and was perfect for those hot summer days when turning on the stove was the last thing you wanted to do. Blue crab was a really common and affordable food for a lot of coastal communities. It has become a sought-after item in places like Maryland and Louisiana and the Carolinas. But how did it get here? Blue crab was considered an everyday coastal food that was abundant among fish markets and fishermen. You would go take a walk along the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, and all you would ever see is a seemingly endless supply of blue crab that would never really go down either. For a lot of working-class families, this was a staple protein that was really helping them get through the day, while also making sure they were meeting their nutrition needs. Now, the labor process here was really hard. It took a lot to make blue crab, and cracking blue crabs to get the different kinds of meat was really time-consuming. It meant that they were less desirable for other consumers who basically would prefer lobster or oysters, especially the rich kind. They were really cheap and they weren't ever given away in fishing towns. People made use of everything they could, mostly because they were so available, you know? While you would think that would mean that people would essentially always sell the excess fish, they would actually just stock up on it for winters and consume it. Blue crab started to become expensive thanks to the rise of commercial fishing and a lot of environmental work that had risen in the Chesapeake Bay. Blue crab populations were starting to decline really sharply, and it became a thing of national concern. That and the high labor cost meant that blue crab was starting to get really pricey. Loved that. So squash might not be our top pick on a regular day, but Grandma's squash casserole was so irresistible that we found ourselves going back for seconds, or even thirds. This casserole was a staple in Southern cuisine and was Gram's favorite way of sneaking nutrients into our dinner. Squash is rich in vitamins A and C, potassium and fiber, making it a wholesome choice. Now, this dish was typically famous in the summer when squash was available in abundance, but you could freeze the veggie and enjoy it all year round too. Squash casserole was highly customizable, meaning Gram could tweak it by adding cooked bacon, sausage, or even fresh herbs. The secret ingredient that gave this bad boy its unique taste was a dash of hot sauce, so next time you attempt making this dish for a potluck, don't forget the key ingredient. Thank me later! Another wonderful appetizer was broiled Parmesan tomatoes, which were ready in about half an hour and were the ideal sidekick for some boiled or fluffy eggs alongside biscuits. Fresh, ripe summer tomatoes, filled with concentrated flavor, topped with an olive oil spray and kosher salt, sound like a really good time, not to mention the main selling point. The Parmesan cheese added so much flavor and style to this that it became a trending option in the mid-90s and was a frequent sight in many cookbooks in the States, especially those aimed at housewives and home chefs. Many of Grandma's broiled Parmesan tomato recipes are available online, showing how they have stood the test of time and continue to be passed down within families. The next thing we have on the list is salmon croquettes with creamed spinach. Now, on paper, this sounds like just what you would need, right? It's salmon, so there's protein. It's creamed spinach, so you definitely have a side that's jam-packed with nutrition. I mean, it seems ideal, the kind of thing you'd always want to be eating at work. For a long time in the 80s, that was how it worked too. People, particularly those working office and desk jobs, were very fond of this kind of lunch. It was also the perfect change in flavors from what people were originally used to. However, this was probably even more reliant on advanced preparation than egg salad stuffed tomatoes. That just wouldn't work with the way so many people were re-entering the workforce in the second half of the 20th century. It basically meant that your wife would have to stay at home and do kitchen duties every day, and most wives were opting to go to work instead. Labor-intensive meals like this, as a result, just didn't last in the long haul. Stuffed potato pancakes are a delight to have on their own, but they go great with any kind of syrup or dip too. And if you had grandkids coming over and did not know what to make, this was a surefire bet. Potatoes have always been a massive staple of American cuisine and culture, partly because they form the basis of many simple, affordable dishes. An example of this is how in the Depression there were several potato-based dishes that people regularly adopted, and they stuck in the cultural landscape of American cooking much longer after the dust from the recession had settled. In states like Ohio, Oregon, and Idaho, it is still common to see potato-centered dishes taking the #1 spot. So imagine the rounds they made back when they were truly in style. Taking a break away from the McDonald's and the Wendy's, stuffed potato pancakes usually have bits of meat stuffed in them like sausages, pork, or ground beef. And it is not only packed with flavor, but a great dish to eat if you are looking to bulk up too. Grandma does know best, after all. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your When life hands you a cow but almost nothing else, you cook the cow's brains. Fried cow brains, or calf's brains, if you want to sound a bit more gourmet, was a Dust Bowl specialty not because people wanted to eat it, but because they had to. They were not fastidious in the past. When you had to fight for your life, you ate everything that was on the animal. Now, I know that fried cow brains may sound like something that shouldn't even be considered food, let alone something that might be considered delicious. For this dish, brains were washed in water or milk, dredged in flour, and fried until brown and crispy. Consider them as the first-generation chicken nuggets, if chicken nuggets had a soft core and came with a helping of angst. The flavor? It was mild, almost buttery, and that was the reason why nobody fled from the dish when somebody served it. Cow brains fried were dense in nutrients, especially protein, and thus a good meal during famine. While nowadays people might shudder at the thought of consuming brains, in the past, it was simply Tuesday's supper. And hey, if you put some gravy on top, it might just seem like you're eating gourmet food. Now, as far as cold and chilled dishes go, a salad is something people can cope with, but cold roasted beef with horseradish sauce? By God, it's almost blasphemy. Really? Cold beef? You ever heard of that? It was a shock to me too. I think most of us have just grown up assuming all meat-related dishes are supposed to be served hot by default, you know? It was these thin slices of roast beef that were packed in a dipping sauce, but it was still something to get used to. Now, I'm not really sure what the idea was behind this. I guess it is true that microwaves weren't exactly a function of everyone's homes, and lots of sandwiches would just go cold. If you eat enough of those, it can definitely develop into like a habit, but to have this as a preference? Chat, I'm just not sure how I feel about this one. What would you guys think? If you give it a yes, I'm taking this to work tomorrow, so just think with caution, okay? That lunch break is really important. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Leftover turkey in the fridge? Consider it your lucky day because that used to call for Grandma's legendary turkey noodle casserole. This casserole made mornings after Thanksgiving something to look forward to. This was the go-to recipe for using up leftover turkey and noodles after Thanksgiving or Christmas. All Grandma had to do was mix in the ingredients and add a topping made from breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even fried onions. Like most of the casseroles on this list, this was also a one-dish wonder and didn't require much labor. And you know Gram used to be tired from making us a grand feast the night before, so this was an easy way to serve something delicious on the dining table without putting in too much effort. This was a kid-friendly meal that appealed to even the pickiest eaters. What's not to love about a creamy sauce and some noodles all drenched in cheese? So, like I was just telling you, Spam used to be the next big thing, and for good reason too. We had things like Spam and cheese roll-ups. A typical 70s office lunch would look like slices of Spam that had been rolled up with mustard and cheese. Now, these could either be grilled to enhance the smokiness of the Spam and make it contrast nicer with the pineapple, or you could bake it so that the cheese would melt and the mustard would mix in with it better for an overall more well-rounded flavor. All things considered, this was on the right track. It was quick, it was tasty, it was healthy, and it was also what people needed during a time where re-entering the workforce was really hard and put a lot of people out of their usual routines. The thing is, America is known for fickle trends. We'll like something one day, swear by it the next, and forget it halfway into the night. Spam and cheese roll-ups were good, but they took a sideline and started being party food more than a work lunch. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. Tuna salad made a fresh comeback, which helped extend its shelf life in the American homemade breakfast or lunch scene. The tuna salad everyone was already pretty accustomed to was reconstructed, this time with seasonal and tropical fruits like apples or cranberries and served in fresh pita sliced in half. Not only was this really healthy, but it was also intensely high in protein and carbs, so it helped you build that all-important muscle while keeping you full until a suitable time in the evening. Cannot give in to those post-meal munchie cravings, right? Tuna salad was great served as is, but some people would go a step further by baking it for a while too. That wraps up our trip down lunchtime memory lane. Let us know which one hit you right in the nostalgia, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.